Right. So what we have discussed in the previous session about assessing capability gaps. So before that, one has to define the business need. Once we have defined the business need, to define the business need, business goals and objectives are essentially important. So once we have defined the business need, the next thing what is that we have to do is to assess the capability gaps. To do capability gap, the first thing what is that we have to do is to understand the existing system. That's what we have discussed. In this existing system, we need to understand the existing process and the kind of features which are involved in it. At the same time, how this system is performing, what kind of problems they are facing, followed by intensity of the problem, all these. So once we understood the existing system, the next is called proposed system. In this proposed system, we need to understand the kind of solution what an end user is expecting. Followed by this, how immediate is this? At the same time, trying to understand the kind of possible constraints, expectations, all that. This is also comes under the proposed system. So followed by the proposed system, the next is future system. Understanding about the future system is to retain the customer on a high level note. This is one way to assess the capability gaps so that we'll have a clarity over the solution, what is that we are about to develop. Now, apart from that, when you want to assess the capability gap, we must be knowing about enterprise architecture. This is what generally we must know. Now, what is enterprise architecture stands for? Enterprise architecture is a kind of framework. Of course, architecture is entirely a technical level of preparation, usually, because technical architectures, all these, whatever the enterprise architecture I'm talking about, either it could be applications, systems, data, all that. So these are all technical architectures because there will be a role called architects in organizations when we are application development, when we takes place. Like as you have project manager, as we have business analyst team, there will be a role called architect. Normally, different names people uses usually in real environment we have, right? So in some projects we call them as solution architects, right? So some people called as data architects, all that. So because architects are different types, because there are a lot of architectures and architects are there, right? So this is not one or two. There are different type of architectures or architects will be available. So these are the different types of architect roles, I can say. Rather than everything, I can always say that architect roles, whatever you can see here, these are the different roles of architecture. The first related architecture, some related were business oriented. Business oriented is one kind. Development oriented is the second kind. Operations oriented is the third kind. Vendor oriented is the fourth kind. So this is how generally this architectures for any application will be divided. Orientation, right? So business orientation means whatever the enterprise level understanding. At the same time, enterprise in connect to that enterprise, again, we have business architecture, right? So all these things comes under business oriented part. Next, development oriented. Development oriented means whatever you are developing, that's what we call it as development orientation. So whatever the kind of software you are going to develop, the kind of applications we are going to develop, the kind of data we are developing, all these things comes under development oriented. Next thing is that, next thing we see operations oriented. Operations oriented means while we are working on the application, either it could be cloud based environments or the kind of network we are using to develop the project, right? So because architectures, security of the application, routers, firewalls, all these are important for any systems to manage within the organization. So this is all something relating to operations orientation. Next, vendor oriented, finally solution architecture means what kind of solution you are going to provide. That's what generally we call it as solution architecture is. So these are the different roles are prevailed in any of the projects usually, right? So because I don't say that all these are available, depends on the kind of project, depends on the kind of rules what they have defined. So this sort of architect roles are available in organizations to us usually. So, but being a business analyst, why are we learning this? Right? So this is the next question one has to understand. The reason why are we learning, because one should able in a position to know about the importance of architecture, wherein you must be knowing about the business architecture first. Because unless until being a business analyst, if you don't understand the business architecture, then there is no point in providing solutions to the customer. So business architecture is not something confined to the goals and objectives as well as goals of what customer wants to achieve. Of course, there are some other things else apart are included in it. So one must be knowing about enterprise architecture for sure. This is what generally an enterprise architecture framework. Technically speaking, if you want to implement this enterprise architecture frameworks, there are different frameworks, something like TOGAF. You might have heard about it because I'm not going in detail on it. That's not relevant even. TOGAF framework, JAXMIN, right? So there are different frameworks are available. So those frameworks use us in this enterprise architecture for a better understanding. Because to develop enterprise architecture for any application, TOGAF framework will be used, the open group framework, application framework, or else another framework called JAXMIN, right? So different frameworks will be used by the organizations to have a detailed overview. But that's not something relevant, but we need to understand about what are all there in enterprise architecture. If you see enterprise architecture framework to understand, again, there are four different architectures will be there under enterprise architecture. The first was business architecture. The second was data architecture. Third, application architecture, followed by technology or systems architecture. These are the four architectures will be there under enterprise architecture, because enterprise architecture has a high level note if you see. So it contains four different things. One is business architecture. Second is data architecture. Third is application architecture. Fourth, technical architecture. Now, what business architecture stands for? Business architecture is a combination of the business activities of any organization. This is what generally the business architecture you can see. So business architecture is combined with these many things. Business architecture will explain this, because why do we require to know about business architecture for any enterprise? Because of these reasons. First point, because these are all something we must be knowing. So why these policies, rules and regulations which was prevailed in the organization was created, for what reason? In the context of the business I am talking about, it is nothing to do with application, okay? It is to do with business. The reason why, being a business analyst, this business architecture, this sort of knowledge and understanding, which is beneficial to you to understand when we are assessing the capability gaps, all that stuff. Because business architecture gives a clear idea for you. Of course, data systems, applications, that takes care of technical people, development team, all that. So let's not get into that. Of course, that I'll explain what exactly it is, but that detailing is not needed. But knowing about business architecture is essentially important, wherein to know about the kind of policies, rules, and regulations, all these were needed. At the same time, what are the capabilities of the business? What capabilities? Capabilities, this is what we call it as business capability. So understanding about the business capabilities is essentially required equally here. At the same time, we must be knowing about the customers, followed by the competitors, partners, all that, right? So who are our customers, right? So where are our partners and competitors? So that sort of understanding is equally required, knowledge. At the same time, we must be knowing about the kind of vision, strategy, and tactics, because any organization, any organization will have some vision, because this I have mentioned couple of times earlier even, the kind of vision, strategies, tactics, what it requires and what it needed, because what are the different tactics we follow, what are the different visions an organization will have, because every organization will have some vision to achieve. So unless until if you don't have a vision, then there will be no point in running the business. So knowing about the vision and identifying about the vision is equally important. So followed by the vision and all, we must be knowing about the kind of strategies and tactics, what is that they follow. That is required even, because that study for a BA is needed. BA, business analyst team, is needed. Means knowing about the business. At the same time, we must be knowing about the products and services what organization belongs to, right? So they may be from manufacturing, they may be from engineering services, they may be from mechanical electronics, they may be from IT services, they may be from banking and financial services.
Dr. Whitfield gave me the class roster, so I just got all the names.
Please mute yourself, Mr. Tejas.
And I can.
Please mute yourself, Mr. Tejas.
Teams channel there.
Right. So products and services is required. When we are talking about products and services, what are the different products and services this organization performs? Because our clients may be anyone, right? So our clients may be banking clients, financial clients, maybe manufacturing side, maybe from electronics, they may be from healthcare, they may be from retailing, right? So different customers we come across, because solutions we are not providing for one or two, so we can provide for everyone. So we must be knowing about what are the different products and services the organization follows. At the same time, we must be knowing about the kind of initiatives as well as the projects those people are taking. Is there any initiatives as well as the projects they have taken followed by this? Whatever the value streamings they follow, because in order to maintain the quality of the services they are providing for their customers, they have to follow some value stream mapping, all that. So that is required. At the same time, what are the metrics and as well as measures they are taking to improve their performance of the organization? Because either it could be performance of employees, or else it could be something relating to the sales, right? So all these things comes under this metrics and measurements. Metrics means reports. For example, I have given a task to you guys where I have given some 2 weeks time for you to complete. So to what extent you have completed, how come I know? So based on the day-to-day activities, what you are performing, so that I come to know how much work you have completed and what is your available timelines and how much work you can complete. So that I can measure, isn't it? Right. So this is what usually we call it as report generations we do. Different reports I'll be preparing so that I'll have a knowledge over that. This is all something relating to metrics I'm talking about, right? So because metrics are nothing but to evaluate something, right? Evaluating some performance of the application, or performance of the people, performance of the system, performance of the business. It could be anything. So metrics is not something confined only to projects or something like. Metrics for any business is required. So because how their business is performing well or not, say they have to know. So for that, metrics is required and mandatory. So what are the different metrics they follow? What kind of measure and how they are going to measure their business performances? The kind of decisions and events what they are taking. All these things comes under business architecture. So if you'd like to know about an enterprise architecture or a high level note, one must be knowing about the business architecture first. Business architecture means that organization which was prevailed, right? So their policies, rules and regulations, their goal, vision, strategies, their capabilities, the structure of the organization. At the same time, what are the initiatives they have taken so far? What kind of metrics they are following to evaluate the performance of their business within the organization? All these things comes under business architecture. So this is one thing, being a business analyst, one should understand. Why? Because the solution you are going to provide is an integral part of the business. Please do remember, that's not something away to the business, right? So because that is one sort of element which enhances the performance of the organization in one way. That's not only the way, right? So there are a lot of things which are involved in it. Yours is one of it. So that we have to address, that we have to be more clear when you're trying to understand this. This is where generally understanding about the business architecture is essentially important for any BA to perform. This is where generally business architecture comes into picture. Is it clear to everyone?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Right. Right. So this is where generally this business architecture come into picture. So once the business architecture, knowledge over the business architecture, the next data architecture. Data architecture means how the data is storing in the organizations, what kind of database they were using, database designing, all these things comes under data architecture. So data architecture gives So data architecture gives a clear understanding about the kind of data which is using within the organizations. How is this data they are storing? Where are they storing? For that, what kind of database designing they were doing, right? So what are the database systems they were using? All these things comes under data architecture. So business architecture gives you a glimpse over the business as a whole, how the business works, functions, all that. So that's all comes under the business architecture. When you talk about data architecture, we must be knowing about how these data extracts, how the data stores. For that, what kind of database management system they were creating. So how are they creating? So that sort of understanding is essentially required. So this is where and how these data architectures and all everything come into picture, right? So business architecture knowledge is required. At the same time, we must be knowing about what are all the data which is available and how this data is stored, interconnected, right? So that sort of knowledge is required. So that's also part of enterprise architecture. Third one is application architecture. Application architecture is what are the different applications they are using. Because if you take any enterprise, there are a lot of applications were involved in it. A lot of applications will be there. So the applications may be for different reasons. For example, you take a financial institution as an example, I'll give you a bank or something. What financial institutions do? Financial institutions have a lot of activities because they take deposits from the customers. Against to that, they'll pay interest on that. Even they issue loans, right? So they do portfolio management services, like they can assist people and organization in asset management, right? So they can guide people on investing on stocks, right? So purchasing them, their debentures, right? So at the same time, they may be involving in mutual fund suggestions, right? So maybe, so these are all different verticals a financial institution may have. So these are the different business operations, right? So it's because banks not only, I can say financial institution. Financial institutions are not only for deposits and taking deposits. Of course, they can have a service called loans. Loans can be provided by them. At the same time, they can manage portfolio services like asset and portfolio management services for the individuals or maybe for organizations. to manage their business activities, there are a lot of applications are involved. Maybe those applications may be 20, 30, 40 even, right? For example, for back-end operations of any bank, they use core banking, right? Core banking application will be used to manage back-end operations of the organization, whatever the back-end operations, whichever is happening. So that will be taken care of by the banks usually, right? So core banking application will manage back-end operations, all that. At the same time, I can say apart from core banking, maybe CRM application may be there, right? So CRM application may be used for customer relationship management, how to manage customers, all that. Maybe they may have an ERP application which integrates departments, ERP systems they may be using to integrate all the departments, all that. At the same time, they may be required what we call a payroll management system, maybe to manage the payroll of employees, all that. So these are the different applications they use. But make sure these applications were not standalone. These applications were not standalone. These applications will have an interconnect among all, right? So that's how the organization works, right? So for example, we have created an employee, we have created an account for a customer. So customer ID was generated. So that same customer ID can be used for different reasons, for different purposes in different systems. So when this happens, when there is an interconnect among the organization, then only the same information can be carried and can be utilized in other ways around. So if you take any organization from a larger context, any business, there are a lot of applications which are interconnected. There are applications which are different applications will be used by them. And these applications were interconnected. That's where generally application architecture come into picture. Means what are the different applications they use and how these applications were interconnected is all comes under application architecture. Last but not least, technical architecture or systems architecture, I can say. Systems architecture means what are the systems they were using, because they are storing the data. At the same time, they are using some applications and all. Where are they implementing all these? Where are they using? Right. So what kind of systems they are using? Hardware, software, right? So what kind of hardware they are using to manage these applications? What software they were using, right? Operating system. Either it could be for to write some coding and all. What kind of programming language they were using? So hardware, maybe it could be RAM, it could be processor, it could be speed and accuracy of the applications. So this is all something comes under systems architecture, right? What kind of systems they were using, all that stuff. So these are the 4 different architectures which will be a part of enterprise architecture. So knowledge over enterprise architecture for a team, not only for a BA, I mean to say, but of course, apart from BA, there were technical team even, because end of the day, technical solutions will be provided by them. So knowledge over enterprise architecture, which consists of these things, and business architecture is part of enterprise architecture, because unless until if they don't study about these 4 things well in advance, they cannot develop enterprise architecture framework. As I told you, like TOGAF is one kind of framework called the Open Group Application Framework, we call it as. At the same time, there is another framework called JAXMAN. JAXMAN framework is there. So these are the different frameworks we use in enterprise architecture to prepare with. To have a knowledge over enterprise architecture, one must have a knowledge over the business architecture for sure. At the same time, we must be knowing about the data architecture, how the data is being stored. So how this data has been retrieved in the organizations. For that, what kind of database systems or designings they were performing. At the same time, they must have an idea over the application architecture. What are the different applications an organization is using and how are they using all that stuff. At the same time, technical architecture, knowing about the technology, right? So what kind of technology are we implementing here, right? So what are the systems? I can say more or less Technical architecture, nothing but systems architecture. In a more simple sense, I can to understand with what kind of systems, routers, firewalls, all these things comes under systems architecture is. So these are the four different architectures which are available under enterprise: business architecture, data architecture, applications architecture, followed by systems architecture. So these are the four different architectures part of enterprise architecture, which being a business analyst, one should know to assess the capability gaps. Right? So if you want to assess the capability gaps, this knowledge is essentially required. Right? So is it clear? Understood? Everyone? Understood
Yes.
or not?
Yes, sir.
Is it understood?
Yes.
Okay. Fine. Right. So this is what generally assessing the capability gap stands for. If you want to assess the capability gaps, we need to have a knowledge over enterprise architecture for sure, as I told you. For enterprise architecture, just now I have explained you. At the same time, we must have a knowledge over the existing proposed system, all that is equally important. At the same time, we must be having a knowledge over the business need, because defining the business need is one of the key element here. How to define the business need, all these things are essentially required and important. That knowledge even required here. So this is all about assessing the capability gaps. So when part of enterprise analysis, if this is the knowledge area we have taken as a BA, not only to define the business need, not only of assessing the capability gaps, the third thing is that we need to determine the solution approach. Now, can anyone tell me why solution approach is required? Why is it needed? I'm not asking you what is solution here. I'm asking why solution approach is required. Why solution approach is required? Why do we have a knowledge over solution? Why do we require it?
To understand the problem.
Yes, please. Why do I have a knowledge over solution approach? Why is it required?
Understanding the problem clearly.
Okay, understood the problem. Okay, fine.
Um, and
The voice
developing
is very low. I think, who is this? Yeah, Nimisha.
developing the
Please check
project
your mic
plan.
settings. Yeah, go ahead.
Developing the project plan.
Developing the project plan have lot many things, because developing project plan nothing to do with solution approach. Right? So developing project plan have lot many.
Okay.
Anyone? Why and what determining the solution approach stands for? See, before we are getting into solution, we need to have a clear roadmap for that. If you are going to provide any solution, we need to have a roadmap. Roadmap means how to develop that solution is required. So by carrying the remaining two things, because whatever the remaining two things which was already discussed and identified by us, anyway, that will be carried to the next level. So that's a continuous process, which normally we do. But when you want to determine a solution approach, it's not only about understanding about the needs and as well as the capabilities. One should be able in a position to understand the kind of solution approach we are following in the context of the organization. Because organization has been bounded with some processes. right? So organization, we have some standards. Process, I means there are some different standards, procedures which normally they follow. Because for example, some organizations follow like Six Sigma, right? Some follow ISO 9001 standards, right? So different standards and as well as the processes they follow within the organization depends on the kind of organization or the standard type of organization it belongs to. So that is something essentially required when we are developing an solution approach. Please do remember, this is the stage where we are not developing solution at this level, because developing a solution is the next level. So before you are going to develop any kind of solution, how to develop the solution, that sort of understanding is essentially required. This is where generally the solution approach come into picture, right? So how to develop the solution? So what kind of approach do we require to follow? That knowledge, being a business analyst team, one should have. Not only an approach, we must have a clear knowledge over the scope. Scope, nothing but possibilities. Because while you are developing the scope solution and all that, so we must be knowing about the kind of assumptions and as well as the constraints you may be facing in between, right? So there are a lot of assumptions you have to keep into an account when you are going to provide solution. There are some constraints you could face in future, because these constraints may be requirement constraints. For example, assume that you have not collected essential requirements which are needed for the project to develop. What will happen now? Right? So there are possibilities, right? So that we need to understand. So one should be able in a position to understand the assumptions and as well as constraints. Constraint could be anything. Constraint could be that you may not have sufficient requirements with you. First point. Constraints may be sometimes customer doesn't allow you to access some information from their servers and systems due to the security reasons. It could be. Constraints could be a time constraint. It could be a budget constraint. It could be an operational constraint, right? So these assumptions and as well as constraints should also keep into an account before you are going to define the solution scope. Means a solution, if you want to define and develop, there is a scope which has to be identified. Do we have the possibilities? What are the practical difficulties we may be facing in between? And how to encounter those problems? All these things we need to define. This is where generally we call it as defining the solution scope is all about. Is it clear to everyone? Nimisha, Sonali, Tejas, Venkat.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Right. So this is where and what defining the solution scope come into existence. So defining the business need is required. So if you want to define the business need, of course, business goals and objectives are needed. Assessing capability gaps. For that, you need to understand existing and proposed future system, followed by this knowledge over enterprise architecture like business systems, applications, data architecture for sure. You need to identify the solution approach, how to develop, right? So what is it? That is that approach you have to follow by keeping organization process standards into consideration, into account. Next, you need to define the solution scope, right? What are the possibilities? Can we define the scope easily? If yes, what could be the constraints? What could be the assumptions? So that sort of knowledge should be there, right? So that sort of knowledge is required here. This is where generally defining the solution scope come into account. Once we have defined the solution scope, but to define the solution scope, please make sure we must have a knowledge over the assumptions. What are the assumptions should we keep into consideration? And what are the possible constraints do we have? Because unless until if you don't know the constraints, how to overcome must not know. Because we don't do that in the later stages. Because if you are, for example, it is very simple for you guys to understand. If you are working on something or if there is an assignment given to you, so before you are going to start the assignment, you see what are the assumptions and constraints I have to keep into an account. So that you will be planning your solution or the work accordingly, right? Based on the possible constraints, what is that you have projected? May not be 100% real, but possible constraints, which makes you too difficult. So that knowledge should be required here. This is what generally defining solution scope is all about. Last but not least, defining the business need that I'm going to explain you in tomorrow's session. What is defining the business need? How to do that? So what are the points do we require to consider? That I'm going to explain you tomorrow session. Clear, Nimisha, Sonali, Tejas, and Venkat?
Yes, sir.
Okay. We'll meet tomorrow and we discuss about defining the business case. See you then. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.